Canada is often viewed as the United States' more peaceful and progressive neighbour, and in the past it's often ranked as one of the best places to live in the world. But over the last 10 years, this image has been shattered. Over half of all Canadians feel powerless in the decline of their country, now stating that they're being pushed around. And it's not too hard to see why people feel downbeat.
Analysts say there's a ticking time bomb in housing.
You know those signs that say, in an emergency, break the glass? It's time to break the glass.
Because Canada is broken. Our kindness and generosity has given way to naivety and weakness.
In the last 10 years, they have witnessed almost all aspects of their life become increasingly unaffordable, and jobs which once seemed like a given become ever at risk, while what they take home at the end of every month seems to be able to buy less and less. You may be thinking this is a story that you've heard multiple times from all across the world, especially in the United States. But to see why Canada is different, take a look at this graph. It compares the growth of incomes versus the increase in housing costs. In the United States, even though housing costs have spiked at times, wage growth has generally kept pace. But in Canada, since 2000, wages have lagged far behind, and home prices have exploded. This means many Canadians simply can't afford to own their own home, and ownership rates have been gradually declining since around 2011. But this effect has been particularly bad for middle-aged millennials between the ages of 30 and 40. They have seen their home ownership fall by over 10%. Not being able to afford a home, people are increasingly renting properties instead, but the rental market isn't much better. Across Canada, rental vacancy sits at an all-time low of 1.5%, leaving renters competing with hundreds of applications just for a single unit. And in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment has soared to nearly $3,000 a month, leaving less than 1% of rentals which are vacant affordable for the majority of Canadian renters. This pushes many people to the brink of financial ruin, with some even living in cars or being forced into shared rooming houses to survive. Things only seem to be getting worse too, as the wage needed to afford an average rental keeps growing further and further away from the minimum wage. In British Columbia, this effect is the worst, as people need to earn nearly double the minimum wage just to afford an average apartment. As a result, many minimum wage workers now need to work longer hours just to afford rent, which limits their ability to cover other essential expenses. This is just one of the many reasons Canada feels like it's getting worse and worse every year. You may be thinking this doesn't add up, as when we look at Canada's economy, it seems like it's been growing well, but this is something of an illusion. Canada's economy is only growing because since 2020, more than 1.5 million people have entered Canada. So while on the surface the economy has grown, on a per person level, it's still roughly the same size as it was in 2018. Unfortunately, the housing crisis is just the tip of the iceberg. While Canada's population has surged, so too has the size of its government. In the 3 years following 2020, the BC government alone grew by 23%, with the federal government adding nearly $20 billion in costs since 2015. This explosive growth is funded by higher taxes, further straining Canadians who are already struggling with the rising cost of living. When Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, it seemed like the beginning of a new dawn in Canada, as he pledged to fix many of the issues which were already taking hold of the country. But 9 years later, these issues seem to only have tightened their grip, as living in Canada becomes harder every year. So let's take a look at why things have got so bad, and if they can get any better. Before we start, I'd like to thank Surfshark VPN for making today's video possible. Out of all the subscriptions that I have, Netflix, Spotify, Amazon, the one that I use most is Surfshark, and it's by far the cheapest. While most subscriptions cost upward of $15, Surfshark is just $2.49 a month. And when you split that between 7 friends and family members, it's just 36 cents each. So for less than half a dollar each month, I get access to better prices on products and flights that use browser cookies to make things more expensive. I get to travel the world virtually, and I get to access sites that are blocked by my region, like Netflix from another country. And perhaps most importantly, I protect my anonymity from online companies recording my data. What's even better is that they're running a special holiday promo deal until January the 1st, where you pay less than $2 per month and you get 4 months free. All you need to do is visit surfshark.com/invisiblehand and make sure to visit before the offer ends. Just click the link in the description or in the comments. The reason Canada's economy is suddenly declining is of course not a modern phenomenon, and its causes are actually linked to the reason why Canada was so prosperous to begin with. It's no secret that much of Canada's initial economic success was based around resource extraction. Being the second largest country in the world by landmass, Canada is of course endowed with an abundance of valuable natural resources. Broadly speaking, the three which have defined Canada's economic success are oil, natural gas, and minerals, particularly in the form of mining operations, most notably oil from the Alberta oil sands. Widespread extraction began in the mid-20th century, when advances in technology allowed for large-scale resource development. This attracted private companies eager to secure leases and begin extraction. It also created thousands of jobs, not just in the extraction industries themselves, but also in related sectors like transportation and infrastructure. This economic boom allowed Canada to invest in areas that helped diversify the economy. This was a period of prosperity, where rising incomes and stable employment contributed to a growing middle class. The natural resource sector, coupled with the expanding service industry, provided numerous job opportunities, and for many, home ownership was within reach. Urban centres flourished, and Canada became known for its high quality of life and social safety net. By 2000, Canada had a diverse economy that mirrored many other developed nations, with its service sector being the dominant driver of growth. However, as the economy continued to evolve, new challenges began to emerge. The very industries which had driven growth were now starting to cause problems. Employment in oil and gas peaked in 2014, and since then it's been in steady decline, dropping by around 23% in the years that led up to the pandemic, translating to significant job losses. While crude oil, Canada's big commodity export, helped the country get through the global financial crisis relatively unscathed, the fluctuating prices are now putting the economy under severe strain. This decline in traditional resource-based industries highlights a broader vulnerability within Canada's labour market. Many of the jobs that sustained economic growth in the past are manual or routine in nature, making them particularly vulnerable to automation. As automation transforms key Canadian industries such as manufacturing, natural resource extraction, and agriculture, workers in these sectors face increasing risk of job loss or transformation. Historically stable, these industries are now at the forefront of automation-driven changes, which disproportionately affect lower-skilled, lower-wage roles. This is only going to make inequality worse, as vulnerable workers, particularly those without access to higher education or living in rural areas, face fewer opportunities for retaining or transitioning into high-skilled jobs. Regions like Alberta, Newfoundland, Labrador, and rural areas of Quebec and Ontario, where these industries dominate, are likely to experience the greatest job displacement. Rising unemployment and inequality are being compounded by Canada's ever-increasing housing unaffordability. Earlier we highlighted just how severe this issue has become, and the reasons for its intensity in Canada compared to other nations are slightly more nuanced. One major factor is Canada's unique geography. Canada is absolutely massive, but despite its vast size, 80% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border, with half of the population concentrated in this narrow southern belt. Ontario is home to about 38% of Canada's GDP and serves as a hub for most of the country's economic activity. But this population density along the southern border has led to high demand for housing in these urbanized regions. The clustering of industries like real estate, mining, and manufacturing in these provinces further concentrates employment opportunities and wealth into specific areas, driving up property prices, whilst leaving vast areas of the country underfunded. The reasons for Canada's housing crisis are relatively simple, however, not much is being done about it. Not only are there not enough homes, but the ones which exist have become unaffordable for the vast majority of the population, making home ownership for first-time buyers nearly impossible without an income far above the average or financial support from the so-called bank of mum and dad. This shouldn't come as a surprise. Over the decades, the cumulative effect of not building enough homes has led to a significant supply-demand imbalance in the housing market. It's worth mentioning that Canada has been dealing with a housing crisis in some form for well over 20 years. Major cities like Vancouver and Toronto have always been expensive, but in recent years, this has become even more extreme. To put this situation into perspective, the most recent estimates suggest that to buy an average home in Toronto, a family would need to earn around $280,000 per year. But compare this to the average annual income in Toronto of $120,000, and it's easy to see why many people can't afford a home. In order to afford the down payment or monthly mortgage payments, Canadians have had to take on a greater level of debt, while they can save less and less. Since 1990, Canadian household debt has more than doubled to 184%. Put another way, for every dollar of disposable income, Canadian households owe about nearly double that in debt. Debt has become an absolute necessity, with many Canadians relying on credit cards and loans to afford basic living costs. Like any economic issue, the causes of Canada's housing crisis are multifaceted, but at the end of the day, there simply isn't enough homes to meet the ever-growing demand. Canada's housing supply stands at about 424 units per 1,000 people, which is relatively low compared to other OECD nations. The lack of housing has made it increasingly difficult for Canadians to find a property to buy or rent, and the properties that are available are consuming a larger share of people's income. For many Canadians, the dream of home ownership feels out of reach, as it now takes an average of 15 years to save the down payment on a home, up significantly from past decades. Since 2015, the number of homes listed for sale has continued to decline, while the number of available rental units has sharply decreased since early 2020. In 2022, only about 216,000 new homes were completed, which fell well short of the rising demand and represented one of the lowest figures in recent years. The pace of construction has not kept up with population growth or the recent increase in immigration, and this mismatch has continued into the 2020s. Immigration, while crucial to Canada's economic growth, has been a significant contributor to the housing crisis. In fact, immigration accounts for nearly all of Canada's recent population growth, which has dramatically increased the demand for housing. In 2023, Canada welcomed a record number of immigrants, who primarily came to already overpopulated urban areas, further intensifying competition for available units. For example, the number of international students rose from approximately 240,000 in 2011 to an estimated 900,000 in 2023, more than tripled. This influx of non-permanent residents has driven up demand for rental properties, particularly in cities with large student populations, like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, where rents have soared in response to the heightened competition. There is a growing concern in Canada that the government is using immigration as a short-term fix for labour shortages, without fully considering the long-term impact on living standards. While immigration helps to fill gaps in key sectors like healthcare, construction, and technology, many believe it has worsened challenges, particularly in housing affordability. As rising home prices and living costs outpace wage growth, Canadians feel their quality of life is being compromised. Additionally, inadequate infrastructure and overstretched public services such as healthcare and education have intensified concerns that the government's approach is unsustainable and may contribute to growing inequality. This isn't just a concern in the public, as federal public servants have also raised alarms, highlighting in documents that population growth has outpaced the availability of housing units. While Canada has started to impose stricter requirements for new entrants, many feel this is too little too late. Housing and rent are just the tip of the iceberg, as basic services are also becoming unaffordable. Canadians pay some of the highest fees globally for essentials like telecommunications, with costs 7 times higher than in Australia, and banking fees that rank among the highest in the developed world. This is largely due to a lack of competition, where a few companies dominate entire sectors, driving up prices for everyone. It's therefore no surprise that 66% of Canadians now feel financially trapped, delaying major life plans like buying a home, starting a family, or even retiring comfortably. The dream that once defined Canada feels increasingly out of reach for many. These economic challenges are clear, but they can be addressed with the right policies. Tackling the housing crisis requires a bold commitment to building affordable homes, reforming zoning laws, and incentivising private sector investment. This is a realistic solution, but politically challenging, as resistance to high-density housing, especially from local communities and municipal governments, remains a significant hurdle. However, with coordinated action between federal, provincial, and local governments, and by streamlining regulations to speed up construction, it is possible to make real progress addressing housing shortages. Expanding the housing supply also requires significant public investment, particularly in infrastructure and social housing projects, all of which take time. While the sheer scale of the housing crisis means that these efforts won't yield immediate results, a sustained and focused push over the next decade could begin to make home ownership and renting more affordable for many Canadians. While these solutions are realistic, they require strong political will and a long-term commitment. Without decisive action, the housing crisis will deepen, and Canada's living standards will continue to decline.